Welcome to Block 45 of our Celebrating the States Block of the Month. This is our version of the South Dakota block. For this block, you will need 4 fabrics, a light, 2 mediums, and 1 dark. From the light fabric, you need to cut 4 squares that are 3 inches by 3 inches and 16 squares that are 2.5 inches by 2.5 inches. From the dark fabric, cut 4 squares that measure 3 inches by 3 inches. From each of the medium fabrics, cut 2 rectangles that are 2.5 inches by 4.5 inches and 1 rectangle that's 2.5 inches by 12.5 inches. We're going to start with the 4 3-inch dark squares and the 3-inch light squares. Place the squares right sides together and then sew on each side of the center diagonal line. You can either draw a line from corner to corner to have a line to follow, or you can use diagonal seam tape to help guide you. Once you've sewn a 1/4 inch away from the center line on both sides, cut on the line and you will have 8 half square triangle units. You can press these towards the dark fabric, or if you prefer, you can press the seams open. Trim each of these units to 2.5 inches by 2.5 inches. A block lock ruler is especially helpful to get this done. This is my preferred method of making half square triangle units, but you can use any technique of your choice. For the rest of the block, use 1/4 inch seam allowances unless directed otherwise. Sew a light square to each of the half square triangle blocks. Sew each of the units exactly the same. You should always be sewing a dark fabric to the light fabric. Press away from the light square. There will be 8 of these units. Sew these units together. These seams should nest in the center. The dark triangles should point to each other, and you're always sewing light fabric to dark fabric. You can press these seams to one side, or you can press the seams open. These squares will measure 4.5 inches by 4.5 inches. Place a light 2.5 inch square on one end of each of the 2.5 inch by 4.5 inch medium rectangles. You will sew corner to corner on the light squares, making mirror image sets of 2. You will have 2 sets of 2. Double check that you have made mirror images. Then you can trim the seam to a 1/4 inch seam allowance, or you can sew a seam 1/2 inch away from the first seam, cut in between the 2 seams to get spare half square triangle units that you can use in another project. I press my seams towards the light fabric, but I would strongly suggest pressing the seams open from the back side to reduce bulk. While you're at the pressing station, don't forget to press your spare half-square triangle blocks. Next, we're going to make 2 star point units that are mirror images of each other. It's right about here where I discovered the seam was a little bulky and I'd wished I'd pressed the seams open. You can always use an awl to help you get over that seam if you've pressed towards the light fabric. Press the seam open. These squares will measure 4.5 inches by 4.5 inches. Next, we're going to work on the center row. Place a light 2.5 inch square on each end of the 2.5 inch by 12.5 inch medium rectangles. You will sew corner to corner on the wrong side of the light square, sewing from the inside of the rectangle to a corner. When you sew the light squares on the other end, make sure it's a mirror image of what you've already sewn. Double check that you have sewn the unit correctly, and then you can trim the seam to 1/4 inch, or you can sew the extra seam cut in between to get the spare half-square triangle blocks. For these units, I pressed them both towards the light fabric, although I would suggest either pressing the seams open or pressing one of them to the light and one of them to the dark. Sew the 2.5 inch by 12.5 inch rectangles to each other, making sure you make triangles on each end. Press the seam open. This unit should measure 4.5 inches by 12.5 inches. Next, we will sew the triangle corner units onto opposite sides of the star point units. Make sure the triangle units mirror each other and the light squares are next to the medium rectangles. Press to the center block. Two seams and our South Dakota block is finished. Sew the star points rows on opposite sides of the 12.5 inch rectangle row. There aren't any seams to match up, so this goes together pretty quickly. After a final pressing, this block will measure 12.5 inches by 12.5 inches. For the final pressing, you are going to press towards the center row. Only 5 more blocks and we'll have all 50 states done. We hope you give us a thumbs up if you're enjoying the video. Leave a comment for us. Let us know how you're doing on your Celebrating the States blocks. Share with your quilting friends and subscribe. Thanks for watching and happy quilting!